Reginald Pound was an English journalist and biographer. He was a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and was involved with the Radio Times, the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, the Ministry of Information during World War II, the BBC and the Strand magazine. The book is a chronological tale of people and events in the Harley Street district of London. For this presentation, I'm going to be talking about Herbert Barker. Harley Street was named after Robert Harley, Earl of Oxford. His son, Edward, married Lady Henrietta Cavendish, and this was in 1717, and she was of the Cavendish estate. Edward and Henrietta planned to build residences for the nobility and gentry in this area of London, but because of the South Sea bubble, this was only partly realised. Leases were granted to other developers. The names in the area still reflect Cavendish interests: Devonshire, Portland, Welbeck, Chandos, Wigmore, Wimpole, Mansfield, Weymouth, Bentinck, Bulstrode and De Walden. There are more associated names. Robert Harley was Queen Anne's Lord High Treasurer. Henrietta, Edward's wife's name, and he was the Earl of Oxford, and obviously there was Cavendish Square. In the early days, Harley Street had its own pub, the Turk's Head, 51 Harley Street. To have one's consulting rooms in Harley Street was good, but the lower end was the fashionable end, the south end. Although the book is named Harley Street, much of the narrative is about a Mr. Herbert Barker, who eventually had rooms in Park Lane, which is only a 25-minute walk from Harley Street, where many of his protagonists and antagonists had rooms. Herbert Atkinson Barker, born in 1869, was the son of a coroner in Lancashire with a reputation of holding more inquests than any other in the kingdom. On the 29th of December 1883, he dismissed the jurors, wishing them a happy and prosperous new year. By train, he was the only fatality when it crashed, and so was the subject of the inquest the following week. Now aged about 14 when his father died, finished schooling at Kirkby Lonsdale Grammar School, and then went to Canada. During the storm, he assisted a passenger who had fallen and injured his arm. He had no medical knowledge, but he said he felt a tingling sensation in the fingers and suddenly knew how to fix it, and so started his career in manipulative surgery. He had seen something similar done by his cousin, John Atkinson, a bone setter in Park Lane, London. Bone setting was a skill practiced in rural northern areas where wrestling was a popular sport. Joint injuries common, and there were few medical specialists. Returning to England after a few months working on a farm, he went to London, where he was tutored by his cousin. At that time, in the 1890s, anyone could practice medicine as long as they did not claim to be medically qualified. His first independent practice was in Manchester, and patients were few, until he cured a patient of lameness which had defied a local surgeon, Walter Whitehead, who then referred his nephew, with gratifying results. However, he remained a persona non grata in medical circles, a damned quack, in fact. Doctors would cross the road to avoid him. He wanted to get away from the drabness of Manchester that surrounded him and wanted more distinguished patients, and so London called. Suffolk Place, Haymarket. Unfortunately, he was laid low with scarlet fever, and with money running low had to return to Manchester. Local people couldn't afford much, but he did get a name amongst local sportsmen that caught the eye of a local paper. He realised advertising was good for business. He moved to Glasgow, Sauchiehall Street. He was inundated with patients. Disputes occurred that were recorded in the newspapers for places in the queue. He treated all comers, even if they couldn't pay. His cousin died, so he thought it time to return to London and rented rooms at 72 New Bond Street. The picture here is the closest I found to 72 New Bond Street. On the 5th of January 1905, now aged 36, the Daily Express headline read, "Men, women and children with flat feet and groggy knees were in such numbers that shoppers were obliged to step into the roadway." He saw 114 patients that weekend. He was reported to say that he was not a bone setter. "My work is the adjustment of joints." In 1907, he was able to take over his cousin's rooms in Hamilton House, Park Lane. It was impossible to find an image of Hamilton House in Park Lane in the 1990s, but this is an example of the type of building. Park Lane today is part of a ring road and extraordinarily busy. He was getting noticed with press coverage and was willing to demonstrate his techniques to journalists and to orthodox doctors. One that showed interest was a Dr. F. W. Axel. Dr. Axel was MRCS 1861, LRCP in 1867. He served in the army, rewarded for services, and became a GP in 1872. The day he visited Barker's clinic was a changing point in his life. He witnessed 45 manipulations during which the patients did suffer significant pain, so he offered his services as an anaesthetist. Barker asked if he was prepared to weather the storm. Axel's reply was, "The paramount duty of my profession is to relieve suffering. You must have an anaesthetist." Many patients were subsequently treated using gas. Publicity was good for business, and Barker got a lot of publicity. Unfortunately, bad things happened. A desperate patient went to Barker as a last resort. He diagnosed a tuberculous knee and suggested a surgeon. The patient persisted and so was examined under gas. 3 months later, the leg had to be amputated above the knee. The patient sued. Barker was truly distressed. The case in February 1911 was a cause célèbre in the newspapers. The jury found for the plaintiff, but the damages were only £21. The fee that Barker had charged. It was obvious the jury had sympathy with Barker. His costs, however, were £3,000. £100,000 in today's money. Whitehead, the Manchester surgeon who supported the claimant, wrote to Barker saying, "Every member of our jealous profession will make whatever he can of everything against you, without giving you credit for anything in your favour. A month later, Dr. Axum, Barker's anaesthetist, received a letter from the GMC stating that the MDU had drawn attention to Axum's collaboration with Barker, who was, as we know, an unqualified person. As you can see, prior to the GMC, there were 19 bodies regulating the UK medical profession, and there were a lot of unqualified doctors practicing. Richard Organ was the first doctor to be removed from the register for being unqualified, and that was in 1860. In 1899, the council held its first hearing, which was a doctor facing a conviction for drunkenness. The GMC's legal purpose is to protect, promote, and maintain the health and safety of the public by ensuring that doctors meet its standards for good medical practice. The Medical Defence Union was established 26 years later, and it was established to defend the reputations of doctors who faced legal claims. The MDU, as you can see from this slide, was inspired by the case of Dr. David Bradley, who was falsely accused and imprisoned for assaulting a woman in his surgery. Dr. Axum was 71. In his reply to the GMC, he explained that medical men in practice, specialists, men attached to the services, persons of rank and distinction, and a host of celebrities have sought the help of Mr. Barker, having failed to obtain relief elsewhere. He had consented to administer anaesthetics to relieve suffering. Axum was considered a man with all the attributes of the beloved physician: gentle, reflective manner, utter trustworthiness, and goodness of heart. Many documents were presented in support of Barker and Axum. However, on 24th of May, he was charged with infamous conduct in a professional sense. His name was removed from the medical register. This decision lost the medical hierarchy considerable respect. There were many articles in papers. In the Times, their medical writer inferred that patients were exposed to risk of disablement and deformity because of treatment by a horde of humbugs. Barker's response was that the methods of manipulative surgery should be incorporated into the medical curriculum. That year, His Majesty's Stationery Office published the Blue Book, The Practice of Medicine and Surgery by Unqualified Persons. I couldn't find an image of the Blue Book, but here's an article about it in the BMJ. The highlighted text is illuminating in the strength of feeling. A more incomplete report has rarely been issued from any public department. I feel justified in asserting personal knowledge that in not a few cases the replies given by certain medical officers of health are altogether wrong and misleading, and could have been given only by men whose opportunities of observation are very limited. I have to assert that in not a few towns with which I am intimately acquainted, the replies of the medical officers of health as to the existence and effects of unqualified practice are entirely wide of the mark. There were many exchanges in the press, in the medical press, and in letters both supporting and against the pair. Axum, as you might imagine, was extremely distraught that after 50 years of practice he had been struck off. The controversy was kept alive by the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, and Truth throughout 1912-13. Barker had successfully treated an editor of the Times, one article referring to him as a benefactor of the public who ought to be honoured accordingly. Many surgeons who had failed their patients referred them to him. The turmoil of 1914 saw many changes, but the dispute did not go away. The Reverend J. L. Walton of Southend-on-Sea wrote an article in the 19th century publication outlining the situation. The Archbishop of Canterbury was asked to confer a Lambeth degree of M.D. honoris causa. This, however, would not enable him to practice medicine. Questions were asked in Parliament about the War Office obduracy in responding to Barker's offer of help. The response was such that it was thought the War Office might have agreed, but the medical establishment was firm. 60 backbenchers took up the case. At this time, Barker himself was suffering from back pain that he could not treat himself. Manipulative surgery required a lot of effort. In 1916, there was some rapprochement. The medical press published a full discussion of manipulative surgery, and there were talks between Barker and surgeons from St. George's Hospital about a demonstration of his techniques. Correspondence continued, as did his list of good results and celebrity patients. George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, Augustus John all added their sixpennyworth. So here we are with Augustus John, H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw. In 1919, there were signs of dissolving prejudice, and in 1920, the Royal College of Surgeons of England set up a committee to look into manipulative surgery. 307 notables petitioned the Archbishop of Canterbury for a Lambeth doctorate, but it was deemed inappropriate. His Grace hoped that some other means might be found of marking Barker's eminent service to sufferers. In June 1922, now aged 53, his name appeared in the birthdays honour list for services to manipulative surgery. Evidently, when he informed his long-standing charwoman, she said, "Oh, Sir Herbert." This award stimulated many of his medical supporters from Harley and Wimpole Street to suggest that Dr. Axum's case should be revisited. He would now be 82 years of age, that he should be reinstated. He now could do no harm. As an aside, Dr. Axum's place as an anaesthetist to Barker had been filled by Frank Colley, MD. His breach of the code was ignored by the GMC. Barker had had multiple responses to an advert for an anaesthetist. Admiral Lord Charles Beresford offered to raise the matter in the House of Commons. So there was huge pressure from all sides, but it had no effect on the GMC. Here is an article in the Church Times, Friday, the 4th of December 1925. The view was that the GMC was actuated mainly by consideration for the public, but nonetheless there is widespread feeling that a tribunal entirely professional in its membership and from whose decisions there is no appeal is sometimes influenced by narrow and antiquated points of view. The response to Barker to a personal appeal to the president of the GMC, Sir Donald McAllister, was that Axum had to complete the necessary papers. In 1926, the appeal was rejected. As you can imagine, there was outrage. Scotland differed, and he was reinstated in January 1926 as a licentiate and could once again call himself Doctor. Dr. Axum became a public figure again, and, in the words of the Times, the reason is to be found in the national sense of fair play. As an aside, the Universities Scotland Act 1858 resulted in several items from the college's charter becoming obsolete, and they obtained a further charter on the 31st of October 1861. In 1920, the college enacted changes that allowed women to be admitted on the same terms as men. The day after receiving the information, Barker went to see Axum at his home in Norbury, and how happy he and his wife were. Barker had taken some champagne with him. The Edinburgh physicians had averted the storm of public opinion which was rapidly gathering against medical trade unionism. A final request from Dr. Axum to the GMC for an early meeting, because of his advanced age, was refused, and he died on the 8th of April 1926. There was a general denouncement of the GMC's attitude. This is an abstract from the Journal of Medical Biography, 1995, an interesting resource. The authors, Dr. J. R. Maltby, and possibly more famous to anaesthetists, Dr. J. Alfred Lee. Lee and Atkinson were two authors of the book Synopsis of Anesthesia, or more colloquially, the Anaesthetist's Bible. Rudyard Kipling, Duke of Kent, and Elizabeth Arden. By 1930, Barker had withdrawn from his practice in Park Lane. He was now in his early 60s. As Pound says, it was more nominal than final. He had planned a time of leisure in warmer climates and moved to Jersey. Augustus John, who knew Barker as Bonio, and Bernard Shaw kept in contact. Rudyard Kipling now asked for help for his wife and was prepared to go to Jersey for treatment. Jersey was where Barker was living in preparation for his moving to Malaga in Spain. Jersey was happy to have him. He was reported as being their best publicity man, attracting all sorts of famous people. Jack Peterson, a boxer, and the Elizabeth Arden of cosmetics fame are examples. Kipling and his wife both required help and kept writing to Barker until 6 weeks before his death. Barker was ailing and needed a prostatectomy. There were many advisors for his choice of surgeon. At the same time, there was a bill going through Parliament about the regulation of osteopathy, and there was great confusion about the difference between osteopathy and manipulative surgery. Barker had always denied being an osteopath. 1936 was a significant year. Barker was invited to demonstrate his techniques before some celebrated surgeons, including one who had been so rude, Lord Moynihan. Moynihan did have an ulterior motive. He disliked osteopaths, and Barker had dissociated himself from them. Moynihan preferred a manipulative surgeon to an osteopath. H.G. Wells wrote to him, "I'm delighted to see the obdurate profession has at last taken you to its bosom." Barker's demonstration was on the 22nd of July 1936. The audience was practically the entire membership of the British Orthopaedic Association. He felt as if he was in a state trial. The demonstration on 17 assorted cases was a great success. What he may not have been aware of was the fact that manipulation, since World War I, had become more widely practiced in the medical profession. There was, however, a general acclaim of his work and expertise. Although nominally retired, he was continually sought for help, including the Duke of Kent. The official report of his demonstration did not appear before 27th of February 1937. It was completely complimentary, a landmark in surgical history, said the Observer. A Lambeth degree was still requested, but that and his teaching was curtailed because of the onset of war. Shaw wrote to him again in Guernsey, in the Channel Islands, and said it wasn't safe there. Civil war in Spain had disrupted his plans for living in Spain, and World War II for staying in the Channel Islands. This time he moved to the Isle of Man. He was appointed to the staff of the Isle of Man Hospital and Dispensary. On alternate Sundays, he treated patients free of charge. He started to write poetry. Interestingly, in 1945, Barker solicited some funding from Shaw for the endowment of a Barker bed at St. Thomas's Hospital. Shaw's response was no. He believed that hospitals should all be maintained by the state. The prospect of a national health service was, controversially, in the pipeline. Specialists were very much against it because of the fear of losing their private practice fees. Barker returned to Jersey after the war and, approaching octogenarianism, was not a well man. His telephone still rang frequently and telegraph messages came daily. In 1947 he had a fall and damaged his hands, which disabled him from much practice. On July the 22nd, 1950, the BBC announced the death of Sir Herbert Barker. He was 81. The Times obituary said that by challenging professional skill, he had increased it. He did write a book entitled Leaves from My Life. And it says, to break down the barriers of legally entrenched orthodoxy and attain to wealth and titular distinction while still young enough to enjoy his success is in any field a remarkable performance. Leaves from My Life by Sir Herbert A. Barker. Thank you.